Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chloe Melton, and I work at Hill for Literacy. At Hill for Literacy, we strive to create a world where every child is a reader. Our mission is to advance equitable literacy outcomes for students grades pre-K through 12. As a nonprofit founded in 2001, we provide in-person consulting as well as asynchronous courses that support evidence-based instruction. Also, please stay tuned at the end of this webinar for some very exciting updates on upcoming opportunities for professional learning with our organization. So today I am beyond excited and grateful that Dr. Rachel Brown-Chidsey is here to talk about selecting and implementing effective Tier 1 core reading instruction. As you all know, this is such an important topic and we're very excited to have you all join us today. So a little bit about Dr. Brown-Chidsey, as she has a doctor in school psychology and special education. She was born and raised in Alaska. She started her career as a social studies teacher. She then taught special education after seeing firsthand how many of her students were struggling with reading. Dr. Brown-Chidsey later earned a PhD in school psychology and special education from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's Professor Emerita of Educational and School Psychology and an Associate Professor of Special Education at the University of Southern Maine. However, this fall, Dr. Brown-Chidsey will be returning to her home state and joining the faculty of the new School Psychology Graduate Program at the University of Alaska Anchorage. She's authored several books and numerous research articles about evidence-based instruction and assessment, multi-tiered systems of support, and academic intervention. So again, we are so grateful to Dr. Brown-Chidsey for sharing her expertise with us today. As she's presenting, if you have any questions during today's session, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We're going to have time after her presentation to answer them. All right, let's jump in.
Thank you, Chloe. I'm deeply honored to be here and very excited to share what is probably one of my favorite topics when we talk about effective reading instruction or the science of reading. And so my plan for today is to just situate core instruction within a multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS, talk about the features of evidence-based instruction, look at some research about current practices, and then also examine some of the additional things that research suggests are important to help ensure that evidence-based materials actually get implemented in ways that benefit students. So we've probably all seen more triangles than we ever thought we would. But when we talk about MTSS, there's a rule, you have to have a triangle. And so I just kind of want to remind us all that core reading instruction is that Tier 1 foundation that all students should be receiving every day when they come to school. And it's very important because it literally provides the foundation for everything else. Because the other tiers, for those students who need them, need to be supplemental to Tier 1 core instruction. But core instruction cannot be replaced or eliminated if we want all students to become readers. So what is evidence-based instruction? I'll use that term over and over again today. What do I mean by that? This term has been around for a while in the educational literature, but it became a lot more common starting in 2015 with the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And I have pasted here the definition that's included in the ESSA statute, just as a reminder of what, at least in the context of that law, as well as for many researchers since then, we mean when we say evidence-based instruction. And so it is referring to an intervention that demonstrates a statistically significant effect on improving student outcomes. And there are many, many things out there that claim to be evidence-based. However, they may not actually have that level of evidence. And so in the context of what I'll be sharing today, I'm going to be linking back to this definition of evidence-based reading instruction around the importance of there being actually true evidence with a statistically significant finding if we're going to call it evidence-based instruction. In terms of what are the key features of evidence-based instruction, there have been many, many research studies going back over 40 years that have examined reading instructional practices. And recently, a lot of this literature has been referred to under the umbrella of the science of reading. So the good news is we actually have a lot of information about what reading instruction practices are the most effective for all students. And if we look at those research studies, what we see are several key elements that are key to an evidence-based reading instruction program. The first is that it needs to be structured. This means that essentially there should be a clear scope and sequence that the teacher knows to follow on a daily basis. Within that scope and sequence, the instruction is going to be very systematic and explicit. So systematic instruction means that there's a plan for the order in which you teach things. And so, for example, the order in which we teach certain letter sounds should be governed by their frequency, as well as whether or not they could easily be confused with another letter sound. There are ways of planning that out in advance so that we provide that systematic instruction in a way that is least confusing, most optimal for all students. The instruction also needs to be explicit. An explicit instruction is instruction that doesn't leave room for guessing. Explicit instruction is where we are very, very clear with the students what it is we want them to learn, and we provide scaffolding to ensure all of them learn it. One of the biggest advocates of explicit instruction is Dr. Anita Archer. And if you've ever heard of I do, we do, you do, you know that is sort of the essence of explicit instruction. Within that instruction, students also need multiple opportunities to respond. And that's the interactive component of instruction, where it's not just the teacher going blah, blah, blah all day long and the students passively accepting it. The students need to be engaged with the learning and responding at a very regular interval. They also need to have immediate feedback on their responses. This includes both the positive feedback or praise when their answer is correct, but also immediate corrections if their answer is not correct. This is really, really important because we don't want them to learn something wrong and then have it go into long-term memory and be much harder to unlearn. So within those opportunities to respond, we're looking for immediate feedback, both positive and correction, to help the students know if they are being successful with the thing they're trying to learn. And then in addition, evidence-based reading instruction is going to cover the full breadth of all the components we know are necessary to become truly literate. This will include what we know as the big 5 areas of reading. And so those are phonemic awareness, and phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. But we also know there's some other components to becoming not just a reader, but a writer and a really literate person. And so things like oral language and spelling and writing need to be built into the instruction as well. But all of these together create the conditions for what we would call truly evidence-based reading instruction. Now, also within ESSA, the folks who developed this law and began to implement it provided some additional guidance about levels of evidence. Because in that original definition, of course, it just said you need some statistical significance. Well, there's actually a lot of variability in how much statistical significance might be present in any given study. And it relates to things like the actual research method, the number of participants, what was the dependent variable. Lots and lots of variables go into whether or not the strength of an outcome is really conclusive. And so they provided these different levels of evidence as a way for educators to have some guidelines about what they're selecting, so that then as they consider different programs, they can compare and look at what does the research say and does this meet one of these levels. And so there might be strong evidence, and that's where you have at least one well-designed, well-implemented experimental study. And that term experimental is very important because it means that it is going to provide the strongest evidence that whether or not the program actually worked. Then you might have moderate evidence where you've got a well-designed study and it was well implemented, but it's not truly experimental. This falls into something we call quasi-experimental. Essentially, these are studies where you might be using intact groups of students, classes that are already put together to provide certain instruction. For a variety of reasons, that's not as strong methodologically, but it does provide moderate evidence. And then there could be promising evidence, which would be a study where you didn't necessarily experiment actively to see whether one group of students had outcomes different from another group, but you might have looked at prior outcomes and looked to see if they correlate. How well do they match up with each other? And that would be referred to as promising evidence. Obviously, strong evidence is going to be the best thing to have. But as you'll see as I go through today, we don't really have that much evidence on all of the programs that we probably need to have. And so giving these multiple levels is important for educators as they navigate selection of different core programs. There is also a fourth level, and this is one that is referred to in terms of a promising practice. And this is something that is still under evaluation in development. The data are being collected, and they hope that it will eventually have evidence that it is effective, but it isn't necessarily there yet. These, of course, are ones where we would probably want to be the most cautious because we don't have the evidence yet. The process of designing and implementing these studies obviously is fairly complex. It takes time, but hopefully over time, new programs will eventually have the evidence to support their use. So how do we know if that evidence exists for any given core reading program? Well, there are several resources that I can recommend to you that are designed to provide information about evidence for not just reading instructional materials and methods, but all sorts of different core instructional programs across different content areas. So these are resources where you'll find things about mathematics, science, social studies, et cetera, as well. But today we're going to focus on reading. The first one is called the Best Evidence Encyclopedia. It's housed at Johns Hopkins University, and it goes back a number of years, and it provides summaries of evidence for various curricula areas that just looks at what do the research studies say. I will tell you that it's very in-depth research, but it's not necessarily as user-friendly as some other resources. And then that same team actually at Johns Hopkins created another website and portal where they took some of the findings they had from the Best Evidence Encyclopedia and made them way more user-friendly. And this is Evidence for ESSA. So it's also at Johns Hopkins, but they have it set up so it's very easy to search by the name of a program and look at what evidence they found when they went and reviewed available information about various programs. And then finally, there is the What Works Clearinghouse. This was set up way back in 2001 with the goal of providing educators in general way more information about the technical adequacy and the research foundations of everything that we do in classrooms. And they do have some reviews of specific materials. However, it's not quite as thorough or as easy to navigate as Evidence for ESSA. I will tell you that right now, Evidence for ESSA is my go-to when I want to see what is the aggregate information about a given program. So why does evidence-based reading instruction in Tier 1 really matter? Well, it's because it reaches all students. Tier 1, by definition, is for all students, and this includes students who are English learners, students with disabilities. All students should participate in Tier 1 core instruction because it's going to give them that critical foundation for their overall reading and literacy development. And when that instruction is truly evidence-based, when it is utilizing all of those practices and principles that we know are the best foundation for reading instruction, most kids are going to do really well. It really will result in students developing reading skills on track and in the way we expect. Now, will some students struggle? Yes, they will. However, that doesn't mean that they don't need this evidence-based instruction. They still need that foundation. They also need some other things. And we'll come back and talk about that in a little bit. So I just want to share a few research findings about the role of Tier 1 core instruction and the evidence base for core reading instruction that have come out in the last few years, because we actually have some good information about its role and its relative importance, both in terms of an MTSS and in relation to children learning to read. There was a study that came out in 2017 that was examining overall various components of effective tiered supports, or, what makes an MTSS really work. And what they found is that indeed Tier 1 needs to be highly effective and set up so it reaches all students for the overall system to be effective. Without evidence-based core instruction as the foundation for your MTSS, it's virtually impossible to help students because it's just too resource intensive. Now, this is in contrast to another study that I just happen to really like the name of, and so I'd like to share it when I'm talking about this. And that goes back to 2012. And 2012 was in the early to middle days of this thing that we called the Common Core state standards. We all remember Common Core, even though you don't hear about it as much anymore. And it, came on gangbusters and was very present in the educational landscape of the aughts and going into that next decade. And a research team of Chingos and Whitehurst looked at how schools were making decisions about the core instructional materials they were using, and in particular in relation to meeting those Common Core state standards. Are the materials and procedures they're using matched up to what those standards were saying should be there? And their conclusion at this time, and this is in 2012, is that schools were essentially choosing blindly. In other words, there was no evidence that materials were being selected on the basis of either Common Core state standards or evidence-based practices. It just seemed to be all over the place. Again, very concerning. And so I continued to look at this research literature, obviously, over time. And a study that came out last year was also fairly sobering to me in this regard, because it suggests that we still have work to do to make sure that all of our Tier 1 core instruction is evidence-based. And this was actually a follow-up study that Stephanie Alataiba did, and looking at various aspects of tiered supports and MTSS. And they explicitly went in and did detailed observations of general education Tier 1 core reading instruction and Tier 3 intensive reading intervention. So that they train grad students to go out and do these very detailed observations and record what type of instruction was provided in those two different environments. And what the research showed, what their findings showed, is that evidence-based practices were far more likely at Tier 3, but much less likely at Tier 1. So in essence, aspects of the triangle have been flipped. Yes, we need evidence-based practice at Tier 3 as well, but if we wait till Tier 3 to provide the best instruction, we're missing out on our best opportunities to ensure all children learn to read. And so those findings were just very sobering to me, but consistent with my own research, that we have work to do to help educators select truly effective core reading instruction materials and procedures. So I'm going to share now from a study that I did with a colleague that was explicitly around this same topic and framework of what kind of Tier 1 core instruction reading instructional materials were educators in one particular state selecting. And so we did a survey of principals, elementary level principals, K-5, as well as curriculum coordinators and superintendents, all in one state. And essentially what we did is we asked a bunch of questions about how they rated their knowledge and skills around an MTSS. How knowledgeable are you? How is it going for you implementing an MTSS? And then we also asked them for details about what they were using for core reading instruction in their buildings. And so I'm going to share the findings with you, which I hope this will be helpful and not too sobering. So the results of asking questions about their MTSS knowledge and practices showed that this was what they rated themselves to be a highly knowledgeable group. They know a lot about MTSS and they have MTSS skills, and running anywhere from average to very strong, but it was heavily weighted on the strong end. They also almost unanimously were using MTSS for reading. So this was something they were aware of, they had implemented, it was part of practices within their buildings. And this is a graph that just depicts how the ratings they gave of the strength across the 3 tiers of their reading instruction practices. And as you can see, by and large, they rated what they were doing as good. And some reflected on maybe not quite as good, but overall, this group reported that they know a lot about MTSS, they were using MTSS, and it was going really well. So then we asked some questions about how they went about selecting the core reading instruction materials that they currently had in place. And we asked this from the standpoint of some of the procedures, like who was on the adoption committee, what did you consider, et cetera. And based on those findings, what we found is that 54% of them said that research evidence was the most important factor in selecting a core reading program. And as you can see here, the next number was that ambiguous category called other. 21% said it was something else. We don't know what that is. But interestingly, teacher preference was also notable in terms of its presence and consideration when selecting a core reading program. But, I think the thing to take away from this is over half of them said research evidence was the number one variable that they considered when making a choice. We also asked them then about the types of core reading programs that they, in fact, have adopted and have in place. And this was a forced choice question in terms of, there was another question we asked for the actual name of the programs. We'll come to that. This was us asking them to categorize the programs that they were using. This was in part because we wanted to get a sense of their belief as to whether or not what they picked was truly evidence-based. And you can see that 39% believed that they were using an evidence-based published program. And then compare that to the most frequent answer, where folks were using a combination of materials from multiple different published programs. So not just one core program, but a little of this and a little of that. That was probably the most surprising finding to me out of this whole study that's really stuck with me. There were 10% who said they had a published program, but not necessarily evidence-based. And then there were a few who said that essentially the classroom teachers were using things they created on their own. Thankfully, none of them said they didn't know what was happening in the classroom. But this is what they reported in terms of what they believed were the properties of the materials in place. So then what we also did is we asked them to tell us the name of the materials they were using. And this is where we got more into the nitty-gritty of our own detailed coding and analysis methods. And so we essentially went through that long list of everything they reported to be using. And initially part of the work was just figuring out if different names for the same program were provided, and trying to get everything aligned so that we had a coherent list of all the reported programs. And once we did that, and our research team, did some member checking to make sure that we were all on the same page, they had identified 40 different programs that were in place across all of the schools. Then what we did is we utilized the two of the sources that were mentioned here, plus an additional resource, to determine if the programs that they said were core were really intended to be core reading instruction programs. So this first lens of looking at the programs they were using wasn't based on evidence. It was just based on, is it a program that's designed to be a general education Tier 1 core reading program. And that process involved going to a lot of websites and doing some checking with colleagues, looking at some research articles. And our conclusion was, of the 40, just over half were actually intended to be core reading instruction programs. And the other stuff sometimes really was a little of this and a little of that. A couple we literally never heard of and we could never find them. But then we use those 21 that we could identify as an established published program and did our next level of research on those. And you can see here that we use those resources that I shared with you earlier to see if across the 3 websites, Best Evidence Encyclopedia, Evidence for ESSA, and What Works Clearinghouse, there were documents that validated a claim for evidence for those programs. And so by looking at the Best Evidence Encyclopedia, 2 of the 21 programs that were named had evidence. Evidence for ESSA had a higher number. And keep in mind, Evidence for ESSA is much more recent and has covered a lot more programs. So a little bit of this is a sampling component. But 11, or just over 25% of the programs, had evidence to support them based on the Evidence for ESSA website. And then we also looked at What Works Clearinghouse. The number there was also 2. It's very similar in age to Best Evidence Encyclopedia, so some of its materials were dated. Again, we weren't totally shocked that the number was so low. The other thing that we did was to do our own search of the research literature. So using an academic library, we went and looked up, to the best of our ability, the names or the authors, sometimes both, of all of the 21 programs to see if we could find published research articles about those programs that were not otherwise represented in the 3 websites. And in fact, we did find 5 articles. Most of them were actually from international research and probably were screened out of other analysis of these. So it didn't necessarily contribute a huge amount to our findings. But the other piece that I want to share with you is that in the world of statistical research, we have this thing called an effect size. And an effect size refers to the magnitude of difference between the experimental group and the control group. And anybody who's looked at John Hattie's work knows that he and his team suggest that you need an effect size of at least 0.4 to even begin to see meaningful change. We didn't set any threshold for an effect size other than we were looking for positive effect sizes. And what we learned across all of those resources is that only 3 of the programs that were in use had positive effect sizes that we could find in some sort of published location. So quite honestly, the findings were very sobering because certainly there were a lot of folks not using evidence-based instruction who thought they were. Just if we compare what they reported in terms of the type of program and the actual programs, but also there's not as much research evidence out there as that probably needs to be for educators to make good choices. And as a researcher, that was very humbling because it means that more needs to be done to provide the technical information that schools should be using to make good choices for their core reading instruction materials. So I'm just going to juxtapose these 2 things as I finish talking about this study, because it's a matter of comparing the educators' beliefs with their practices. And remember that 39% reported they were using evidence-based core materials, but there were only 3 of the 21 that we found to be true core with a positive effect size. And only 11 had any kind, the largest number we found was 11, had any kind of evidence available. And so, essentially it looks like in this case, for this group of educators, they think they're using evidence-based practices, but their own stated evidence of what they're doing does not support actual use of evidence-based practices. And at the same time, we don't have enough evidence. There needs to be more available for educators to make good and truly informed decisions. So there are, I think, important implications on both sides of this about what are appropriate next steps when we want to help educators select and use core evidence-based core reading instruction practices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about next steps that you could take in examining your own core reading instruction. And then I'll finish off by reflecting on some additional practices that we know are important above and beyond just selecting a particular program. So probably at this stage in this presentation, you may be wondering, is my program evidence-based? And if you haven't checked, I certainly would encourage you to do some looking around to figure out what is the evidence base for the materials that we're currently using. I will say, based on my own experience with doing this research, that if you are currently using a published standalone program that is by one of the big publishers and is explicitly a core elementary grade reading instruction program, probably the best tool for you to use is Evidence for ESSA, because it's most likely going to quickly provide you with information if it's there. If, however, you're using a combination of methods, let's say you haven't purchased a core program, but all of your teachers are very well trained in explicit instruction and other kinds of practices that we know are very much evidence-based. What Works Clearinghouse is more likely going to be able to provide you with information because they have what are called practice guides that do a very nice job of explaining the nature of evidence-based instructional practices. So those are two resources I'd certainly recommend for you to go and do your own looking at your current reading instruction core practices and see what you find. When I do this with folks in various sessions, usually there are a lot of ahas and wake ups and oh my gosh. And again, it's not all educators are doing the best they can. As we learned, there isn't as much evidence out there as there probably should be. So I'm just going to return to those core features of evidence-based reading instruction in terms of, now what? Remember that we want instruction that is highly structured and it has a defined scope and sequence. And in many cases, what we're going to see is that the lessons are scripted so that there are specific materials for students and teachers. It literally takes the guesswork out of reading instruction to ensure that every student has the best possible opportunity to become a reader. Also included in that instruction, we're going to be looking for opportunities for students to respond so that all students are engaged in the lesson while it's happening. One of the key features when I do classroom observations of my own students are practices that involve having all the kids engaged at the same time in the learning. So these can be things like every kid's got a whiteboard and is writing answers. If you're having students giving verbal responses, it's choral responding. You ask the whole class at once. Those are things that are really important in terms of students being able to engage and have those opportunities to respond. We also want to see immediate feedback, either praise or correction. We don't want kids learning it wrong. We want them to learn it right from the beginning. And then the other piece that I'll mention, and this goes to the fact that not everyone's going to succeed with just core instruction, is that especially recently, the core instructional materials and practices are aligned with what's being provided for supplemental intervention. So in other words, your intervention materials need to be highly similar to your core instructional materials and practices, because that's going to provide the best opportunities for students who are struggling. So let's just go with a scenario that maybe you're working somewhere where you've discovered that your current core reading instruction is not evidence-based. I would encourage you to figure out how it can be changed. A lot of this is core adoption tends to be on a schedule in districts. And so one question would be, when's the next time we're scheduled to do a core adoption procedure? Because it's kind of a big deal and it's very expensive. And so just knowing what's the next cycle, that could be the first step. What are the procedures and who's on the committee? And if you're someone very interested in this topic, which probably you are because you're here today, I would say volunteer to be on the committee, volunteer to be part of the selection process the next time around, to optimize the likelihood that the best materials are going to be selected for the students in your school. That's a really sort of direct action step to take in terms of ensuring that Tier 1 reading instruction is truly evidence-based. But there's also some scenarios in which you may not be able to make any changes to your core instruction right away, particularly if you just did a major adoption, because I'm going to guess it's going to be 5 to 7 years, sometimes longer, before there will be interest or resources to do that process again. The good news is that there are some other tools that can be used with any given core reading program that will help to bring the evidence-based practices into the classroom. And one of the very best examples of that was designed for this purpose, and it's out of the University of Oregon, specifically for primary grades reading instruction K2, and it's called Enhanced Core Reading Instruction, or ECRI. This is hyperlinked in the slides, which you will have available. And it's a very low-cost, well-designed, evidence-based set of materials that you can use in conjunction with whatever else you already have in your classrooms. And if you go and look it up on Evidence for ESSA, you will discover it has strong evidence. And so this is a tool that you could bring in with any given core program that's not super high cost, that would perhaps be the interim solution for your students. Now, there are challenges to this as well, because the scenario here is that your teachers are hopefully trained to do whatever it is they're doing right now. And changing practices means they're going to have to learn some other stuff. And so I recognize that there are components to the professional learning, implementation, and so forth necessary if you're going to layer on to your core instruction. But it may be the best interim solution, particularly if after you look at your screening data, you've got significant numbers of kids who are not meeting those learning benchmarks. Because the higher the numbers who are not successful at Tier 1, the more kids who might be in need of intervention, but we can only do that for a certain percent. We cannot intervene for every single kid in a building. So there are some practical implications to why we need to make sure our core instruction is as effective as possible. I also want to share just some general practices about implementation of core reading instruction that would be true whether you are, at the beginning or middle or end of whatever materials you currently have in place. And so, we will go with a scenario where you have an evidence-based core reading program that's been adopted. And one of the most important things as part of that adoption is going to be planning for implementation through effective professional learning. Probably the biggest mistake I see schools making after they go through an in-depth process of actually selecting high-quality evidence-based materials is they do not put a sufficient investment in professional learning for teachers. So you have these great materials, but the teachers don't know what to do with them. And so making sure that the initial training includes all the right people and it is of sufficient quantity and quality that all of the educators know how to use the materials, feel comfortable with materials, and are going to be able to launch with success. Now, you'll notice here that I've indicated that not just classroom teachers need that professional learning. Your interventionists and your special educators need it as well. And this is because those are folks whose job it is to support the students who aren't getting there with core by itself. It's going to be really important that they know what the core looks like and they know what's included in the core in order for them to do that job. And so mission critical to an effective core is going to be making sure everybody is fully prepared and understands the components of that core instruction, including your interventionists and your special educators. And then in addition to that initial training, we know from the professional learning research literature that ongoing supplemental training is very important in sustaining the effects and the benefits of a new practice. And so I would recommend that you schedule monthly sessions where teachers are actively engaged in asking questions, getting feedback, and working to improve the implementation of whatever you've adopted. Because it's that daily work of, trying it out, learning from it, and improving practice where real gains will be seen. And so making sure that training isn't just a once and done, but it's a continuous process that goes at least over that first year. And then we're going to want to do stuff in the following years as well. Another really important thing about using an effective Tier 1 core instruction is making sure all your new teachers get trained. The first year of adoption, everybody who's there is going to get that initial training. But most of the time, you're going to have some new people next year. And they need that training as well. And so planning for there to be that ongoing professional learning for all new hires is very important. And then there will need to be some coaching for those new folks. And here's where we can fold them into support teams and mentors in buildings by having experienced teachers who have been there a little while help them as they learn to use the new materials. Now, maybe they've used the same program at the last district. That'd be great. They're still going to need some mentoring and support in order to implement it effectively as part of a team within your district. And continue those monthly sessions so that you can continue improving practices. There are some already existing teams in schools that I think are the perfect place for ongoing professional learning. That's very self-directed. These could include your grade level teams, and if you use professional learning communities. Those are, in most cases, already present in your buildings, and the ongoing learning to support effective core implementation can be built into those existing teams. So you don't have to build a whole new structure to make this happen. And then certainly engage in continuous review of student data to identify where improvements are needed. This is where you're going to, really look at your universal screening data, collect that 3 times a year, fall, winter, spring, and see, are there similarities and differences between grades, within grades, across buildings? Where do things need some strengthening? Where are the successes that you can celebrate? That's just an ongoing process of effective reading instruction. So finally, before I take questions, I want to mention some additional approaches that can be highly effective to ensure that all your efforts to select, use, and prepare educators to implement evidence-based reading instruction are actually going to be successful. And this is where some additional practices of support for educators can make a big difference in the long-term outcomes. So the reality is this. I've just spent a whole bunch of time sharing with you all the beautiful ways to select and choose and implement effective evidence-based core reading instruction. But even if you do that to perfection, you will have kids who have reading problems, who struggle to learn to read. And that's because there are a lot of reasons why kids might struggle in school, and we can't control everything. And so we have to be prepared for the students who will need supplemental reading intervention. That might be due to a disability. It might be due to the fact the family moved 5 times last year, and there were a lot of gaps in instruction and days out of school. So there's lots of factors that could contribute to reading problems. We can be in control of how we help them address reading success. And when we start to think about the intervention side of MTSS, this is where I want to get back to that idea of alignment, making sure that our interventions are going to flow seamlessly from core instruction so that the materials, the routines, the procedures that interventionists use look a heck of a lot like what's happening in the general education classroom. That general education learning is the foundation when students need supplemental intervention They shouldn't have to learn a whole new world of everything, new routines, new keywords. No, that's just going to waste time. We want there to be significant alignment so that they can seamlessly go into an intervention session, connect with that learning, and build their skills. So alignment just refers to the extent to which the practices and the materials that you use at Tier 2 and Tier 3 are similar to or the same as what you have in Tier 1. And a study that a team out of Texas did, Stevens et al., they found that when intervention materials were highly aligned with core, students make bigger gains. I predict we're going to continue to see more studies of this because it is a very important subtopic within MTSS and within effective MTSS practices. It used to be when I was starting in the world of MTSS, the assumption was you got to do something totally different for kids who are struggling. Not so much. Research now tells us that we need to be really intentional about layering our effective practices so that those students in intervention are able to immediately go into intervention sessions, access the learning, have lots of practice with feedback, and build those skills at as fast a rate as they can. In terms of selecting and using interventions, as you probably figured out, different is not necessarily better. But there are also some additional ways that we can customize intervention for individual students. We want all of the intervention materials to be aligned with core, but some students may need differential focus and emphasis within intervention. And here's where we can pay attention to some basic, entry practices, as well as some intensification. One of the simplest ways to get started with intervention in a way that's aligned to core is to do double dose. Double dose lessons means that you repeat a part of the lesson from the core classroom with the students who are struggling, because it's then going to give them lots of opportunities to practice. But for some students, that may not be enough. They may need some real intensification. And this is where we're going to modify certain instructional variables around individual student learning. We can look at things such as the strength of the intervention and the dosage. Dosage simply refers to how many days a week, how many minutes per day is the student engaging in intervention. Lots and lots of research tells us that students who are struggling need a higher dosage of intervention. So figuring out where we can get more instructional minutes becomes an important practice. There's a great resource for you around intensification, and this is a screenshot of a summary document, but the National Center on Intensive Intervention has lots of great tools and resources that can be a huge help in working on making sure that your interventions are aligned with your core and that folks have the background and skills to do intensification for individual students. Finally, I want to just talk a little bit about consultation and coaching. These are two different practices that can be an important and effective way to help classroom teachers maintain the success of their classroom practices. Oftentimes they're lumped together, but they're really, at least in the research literature, distinct sets of practices. Consultation typically refers to an external person who comes to the school and provides their expert advice about how to do various things in the classroom. And most of the time, this is going to be less frequent than coaching, but they're going to come in, observe some lessons maybe, and provide some very specific guidance about practices to change. That's a little different from a model of using coaches. And often these days, these are referred to as instructional coaches or literacy coaches. Those are positions that are typically internal to the school. The district has allocated resources, hire people with that as their job description. And these are folks who are going to be able to support reading improvement practices across all tiers. Now, it's really important to realize that the job description of coaches is not the same as an interventionist. Instructional coaches should be spending their time helping teachers teach better. They should not be working with individual students. Now, I emphasize that because I know a lot of instructional coaches who end up being converted to interventionists because the need is so great. Well, that suggests that there's a different issue or systems level challenge of too many students needing intervention and needing to put some focused energy on examining your tier 1 core instruction and figuring out what needs to be changed there, so you will not have as many students who need intervention. So if you find that your coaches are ending up doing interventions with kids, that's a red flag that they're not coaching, they're not doing the job as intended, and that there needs to be an examination of why it is so many kids need intervention. I would say that both consultation and coaching are effective and optional practices that are worth exploring. And really, in my mind, it has a lot to do with process as compared to content. Initial training to use any given program tends to focus heavily on content. Now, yes, there'll be some procedural pieces to that with instructional routines, but it tends to be content heavy. By comparison, consultation and coaching are typically all about the process of implementation with success so that students see better outcomes. And there's some really great research that shows us that consultation and coaching can be very value added to the overall picture of student improvement when it's implemented correctly. And I emphasize that because correct implementation of either consultation or coaching means that those are folks who are putting their time in with the teachers, not with the students. And when I talk about research that supports the use of consultation and coaching, it's research that examined true consultation coaching practices with directly with teachers. And as you can see, I've had too many experiences seeing folks who have a job description that says they're a coach, but they're actually working as an interventionist, and it just is not, it's not moving the needle because it's not in the long term going to fix the system that will promote effective reading outcomes for all students. So in terms of consultation examples, this will probably be familiar to many of you, but when folks meet with either a district or school team to look at specific needs by reviewing screening data, you might have targeted sessions with classroom teachers to look at specific instructional practices. Certainly looking at alignment of materials. As a consultant, I've done a lot of that to see how well intervention materials align with core. Looking at progress data to see, okay, are we seeing the gains for students in intervention that we hope to see and we need to see? And then also summarizing data to kind of help build a blueprint for next steps. Coaching is going to be much more individualized. It has the potential to provide a lot more customization for individual classroom teachers or grade level teams. Typically, coaches have the capacity to do more observing, to do more model and demonstration lessons. They can also do one-on-one meetings, which can set up a really safe context for classroom teachers to ask questions about their instruction that's non-judgmental. And that's, I think, really important, especially for new, younger teachers, so that they have a space where they can get support and not feel as if their job is on the line. And then just daily support of teachers around all of the practices necessary to support effective reading outcomes from all kids, starting with their core instruction. There's a great resource about coaching that I just wanted to call out for you. This is from the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and it really does a nice job of explaining what a high-quality coaching model looks like. So if you are in a district where you don't have coaches, you think, hey, that would be really cool, or you have coaches, but they're doing more intervention with kids, this might be a tool that you might want to look at and share with colleagues to think about how, we're providing this supplemental resource, how effective is it? And then I just want to finish by sharing some links to some really great resources that go into way more detail than I could cover today about what are the properties of effective Tier 1 reading instruction. How can we align our instruction across all tiers to maximize outcomes for kids? How can we find out more about effective reading instruction practices, including things like the science of reading? So all of these are hyperlinked and will be in the slides when you receive them. So hopefully this has given you an overview of why MTSS requires evidence-based reading instruction, and that despite this, too many schools are still not using evidence-based core instruction. There are tools to figure out whether or not your core is evidence-based, but often effective practices will require more than just adopting a core. There needs to be ongoing professional learning and support for teachers over time in order to ensure that, you know, all of the energy spent on investing in evidence-based core instruction is actually resulting in the best outcomes for kids. So here are just a few references, and then I'm very excited to take any questions that you have. Chloe, I think you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. This is information I know when I was teaching, I really wish I would have had. It would have been very helpful, especially the information on the different levels of evidence. That is so important, as we know, when looking at adopting and implementing programs, but not something that we're explicitly taught. So I really appreciate you covering that. I believe we only have time for one quick question, and this is coming from the audience. And the question is, what are your suggestions for Tier 2 instruction? And this person is asking, I think that, sorry, I lost the question, but yeah, recommendations for Tier 2 instruction. This person is stating that they have kind of a wide range of supports in place and kind of helping narrow that down.
Great. That's a great question. One of the most common ones I get. And really, the most important starting practice for examining your Tier 2 interventions is going to be to look at how well are they aligned to your core instruction. And I literally often do this as an audit practice with a school where I will go in and I'll create a matrix on a whiteboard and say, okay, tell me every single product or intervention that you have in place at every grade level. And do a side-by-side comparison then to see how well aligned it is with what's happening in core instruction. A lot of times folks discover there were things happening they didn't know about. A lot of times they discover there's some redundancies that might need to be addressed, and they are able to winnow down that group of Tier 2 interventions to a set that are a lot more aligned with their core instruction, and for which they can make sure that all the interventionists are well trained and have all the materials that they need. So that's probably the first entry point. And then, you know, beyond that, certainly mission critical, collect progress data over time and evaluate whether or not students participating in different interventions are making the expected gains. Because if an intervention is truly, you know, going to be effective, all the kids or most of the kids in an intervention group with the same intervention should be showing progress. And so use your progress data then to go back and re-review your Tier 2 interventions and make some selections about what to keep and what not to keep.
All right, thank you. That's fantastic. All right, so we are going to wrap up. Again, thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today and sharing your insights on the importance of Tier 1 instruction. As we know, there's so much work to be done, and those of us in the field really appreciate your dedication and contributions. And thank you to all of you in the audience for joining today's webinar. The session, there's a question about this being recorded. Yes, the session is being recorded, and we're going to send everyone who registered a link to this recording tomorrow. So if you'd like to learn more about Hill for Literacy, you can visit our website at hillforliteracy.com or follow us on LinkedIn and other socials. So just a few points about the work that's happening at the Hill for Literacy. We are releasing our latest course on high quality instructional material implementation. This course is designed to be your companion as you unpack and implement your core program and supplemental materials. This summer, we're also offering our signature Science of Reading courses through open enrollment. And we will have a link for you to learn more about that and to register as we follow up. This is a really big, exciting announcement that I'm very honored to share with you all. So we are very excited to share that for Massachusetts-based educators, Hill for Literacy has been chosen to be the vendor for DESE's Literacy Launch Institute this summer. These 4-day institutes are an incredibly exciting opportunity for Massachusetts educators teaching students from preschool to grade 3 to learn more about the evidence-based and culturally and linguistically sustaining early literacy practices that all of our students need. With 5 differentiated tracks, there's a pathway for every educator to build their confidence and expand their expertise. So space is limited, and we're very excited to announce that registration is open as of today. You can visit literacylaunchinstitutes.org. As a quick note, we are going to be taking a break from our speaker series, but please stay tuned for some exciting panel discussions as next school year begins. Thank you again for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful day and take care, and we'll see you next time.